Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you all for coming. Welcome to the Imperial College Festival, and in particular, since it's just such a beautiful day outside, and there are lots of fantastic things to do, thank you very much for spending a bit of time in this room. Now, I'm going to play the piano. No, I'm not. I'm going to give you a talk instead on the following subject. We don't make anything anymore, with the subtitle here, Our Economic Future in an Intangible Intensive Economy. I'm going to speak for about half an hour. I'll try not to go on for too long because there's still lots of good stuff to do outside. And then those of you who want to carry on the discussion, we're going to go opposite the room, and there's going to be a podcast there, and we're going to have a Q&A session. So anybody who wants to carry on the discussion, ask some questions, this, that, and the other, very happy to do that. That'll all be sorted out by podcast. And all the helpful people wearing the T-shirt, can you stand up, please, sir? All these helpful people wearing these T-shirts will guide you over to the room immediately opposite. My name is Jonathan Haskel. I have the honor to teach at Imperial College Business School, which is the building over there. If you came into the big entrance where the drones are flying around, that's us. And we teach a suite of business degrees, both to the postgraduate students and to the undergraduate students. And this work is around a book project with my co-author, Stian Westlake. He's currently the special advisor to Joe Johnson, who is the science minister. And our book is called Capitalism Without Capital. So let me tell you a little bit about what it's about. And in order to tell you what it's about and hopefully give you some insight into this question about intangibles and explain something about not making anything anymore, we're going to start by going back to the 1880s. So here's a picture of innovation in the British economy in the 1880s. Now, since I teach at a business school, I'm going to have to ask you lots of questions, right? So you're going to have to do a bit of work. You're not allowed to just sort of sit there. So here's a factory. Let's have a look on the left-hand side just to start with here, the left-hand side of these two pictures. Here are a whole load of women working at a factory. This is a factory in Bristol. Anybody like to guess what it is that they're doing? What was a big industry in Bristol in the 1880s? Tobacco is who said tobacco? I didn't see who said it. Thank you, sir. Tobacco is the correct answer. And so they are rolling cigarettes. So this is the Wills factory in the 1880s. The two big industries in Bristol at that time were tobacco, and the second big industry in Bristol? Shipments of slaves, exactly. So they swapped the slaves for the tobacco, and there are lots of names of streets in Bristol with interesting names all related to that kind of trade. So here are a whole load of workers, and they're rolling cigarettes in the factory. How many cigarettes? Who's a roll-your-own smoker out here? This is a bad question because there often aren't any. How many cigarettes do you think you could roll every hour? Every minute, sorry, every minute. What would be a nice? Every minute. Somebody's phoning in with the answer. So a skilled cigarette roller could roll how many any minute? Any guesses? Four is a very good guess. That was the sort of bench line productivity for a skilled cigarette roller. And who in particular would be really good cigarette rollers? You'd have to have very small fingers, right? Children would be very good. So lots of kids were employed. So is there anybody here who's at school? Is anybody, any school kid? I see you two. How old are you? Sorry, the girl with holding the thing. How old are you, may I ask? You're 11. What do you think, how old do you think you could leave school at back then in those days? Do you want to have a guess? At 10, very good, absolutely right. That future Imperial College student sitting there. Ladies and gentlemen, so that means that instead of being at school, you would have already have been working in the factory for a whole year. And this work was pretty good work, actually. You got paid pretty generous wages. Wills were quite generous employees. And since you're the other person who's at school, I'll ask you this question. What else did you get as well as wages at the end of the week for working hard in a cigarette factory? Nothing? I'll ask... Any guesses? You get some cigarettes, exactly right. So you get wages, you get cigarettes. I mean, this is for children, this is actually a pretty good job. Okay. So here they are. So here they are. Press the wrong button. Sorry. Here in the 80s. Then along came this machine. Now this machine is called a Bonsack cigarette making machine. It was patented in the 1880s and introduced by Wills in 1883. And this is the first cigarette-making machine. And basically, I'm probably going to embarrass myself because there are probably some expert machine people out there. But essentially, you put the tobacco in the top here. It all went through this hopper. And then the cigarette paper was rolled out here. And then it all rolled out here. Then it was sort of cut. And then the cigarettes came out here. So these skilled school children could do 4 an hour. 4 per minute. I beg your pardon, 4 per minute. And the cigarette machine, any guesses on how much a cigarette machine could do? 100, more than 100, go on, sir. 200 a minute, exactly right. So it could do 200 a minute. So this was a pretty remarkable increase in productivity. It was obviously bad news for all these kids, but on the other hand, they did raise the school leaving age just around then, so they would have had to have gone back to school. But nonetheless, that's what, at least to me, innovation looked like in the 1880s. All right, let's fast forward now, and let's study innovation in the UK economy in the 2000s. Another question for all of you. Britain's most famous recent innovation. What is the one innovation, even remote tribes in the jungles of South America who've not yet discovered civilization have heard of this innovation, this one great British innovation which has swept the entire galaxy? Yes, you've got your hand up. The internet. Bigger than the internet. Surely bigger than the internet. I didn't hear that, sorry. TV, steel, no, there's only one answer. Yeah, go on, sir.
ARM's chip.
ARM's chip. Bigger than ARM's chip. Surely bigger than ARM's chip. Go on, someone's got their hand up very politely at the back. Fire. Well, fire is an older innovation, actually, a pretty big innovation. Now, I'll tell you what the answer is. That is surely the answer, right? This has to be Britain's biggest innovation. Like I say, everybody's heard of Harry Potter. Now, what are some other innovations in the modern era that we might contrast? So EasyJet. Those of you like me who like flying EasyJet, I think EasyJet is an incredibly innovative company, actually. Other innovations, coming up on the slide there without my doing anything. So here's here's the wobbly bridge over here, invented by Arup in conjunction with some Imperial engineers. And here's the City of London behind there. Lots of people say the City of London, very innovative, in inventing new financial products, all that kind of thing. Here's Grand Theft Auto. This is one of the world's best-selling software software computer games. It's sort of set in this mythical kind of inner city Detroit, violent area and all that kind of thing. It's written by a load of computer programmers in Croydon. Here are the Beatles. Of course, innovation, don't need to tell you about that. And then here's Tesco's club card here. Very innovative, the use of the club card data, matched together with all their supply chains and all that sort of stuff. Now, the distinguishing feature of this innovation is this type of innovation looks rather different, at least to me, to the kind of cigarette machine innovation we had before. What we had before was we had the mechanization of very routine tasks. These types of innovations seem to be much more centered around knowledge. So the thing that EasyJet are really good at, they're not good at airliners, Boeing are good at airliners, the thing that EasyJet are good at is they're good at the kind of process engineering about getting you quickly onto the plane. They're very good also, they've got terrific software which could, bundle in hotels and, sell you at car hire and all that sort of stuff as well. So there's lots of kind of knowledge, process knowledge around EasyJet branding, all those kinds of things. The City of London, again, the City of London is not kind of machines and, that will kind of roll cigarettes faster. What the City of London is about ideas, bundling packages of financial services together, giving you advice on tax and all that kind of thing. Grand Theft Auto is a piece of software. And what is software? Software is just kind of codified knowledge. So another strongly intensive knowledge-based innovation. What were the Beatles about? Again, the Beatles weren't machines or anything like that. The Beatles were about, ideas and having their, whole book of songs and all that kind of thing. Now, of course, there's an active argument about how original the Beatles were and didn't they all copy it from other people and all that sort of stuff. But again, it's machines and it's much more intangible. And then, likewise, Tesco's use of data is a bit like EasyJet. It's a merging of all the knowledge that they've got to then inform how they stock, how they do their supply chains and all of that. So there's a big kind of synergy in Tesco built around the kind of knowledge of your shopping habits and mine, which then inform the shelves that they stock and how often the trucks come and all that kind of thing. So all of that adds up to the notion that investment, has become much more what economists like to call intangible. So investment used to be this, tractors, trucks and machines, and now it's much more around R&D, things like branding, logos, publicity, software, all those kinds of things. It's the shift then from these very tangible types of investments to these much more intangible types of investments like R&D and software and all of that. It's that shift which we've chosen to try to document and try to study in this book and try to understand thereby what the implications are of an economy which used to be mostly composed of these very tangible investments, machines and buildings and all of that, and now is composed of these much more intangible investments. And if you want some sense of the numbers, here's a graph here from the United States. I'm sorry this has come out rather small. Starting in 1947, going up to 2009, and the blue line tells you the share of investment in the US that is in these intangible items, like design and software. I'm going to give you a little list in just a second. And the red line tells you the share of investment which is in tangible items. Now, what's remarkable is, since the late 1940s, the red line is amazingly stable. It's kind of fallen rather, just predating the financial crisis and around the financial crisis. But it's remarkably stable given that it's a line which has been going on for 60 odd years. And a similar line, you get a similar plot for the UK and for many European countries, although not all. And what does that tell you? That tells you that, remarkably, 12–14% of GDP every year is spent on tangible things. The building we're in, the machines that you see in front of you on the computer, the cars and the trucks and the vehicles you have, driving up and down Exhibition Road. So remarkably, the US and many other economies have been spending around 12 or 14% every year renewing those types of equipment or improving those types of equipment. But back in the 1940s, spending on these intangible investments was rather low, at about 5%, but you can see it's been climbing. That is to say, the nature of economies has changed. They've just changed from these much more tangible, as I say, to the more intangible. So if we were to run this back to the 1880s, this type of investment here, the tangible investment, would be on the types of cigarette machines we were just seeing, whereas the investment today is around software and branding and all of that. Okay, so that's sort of a sense of where all this is going. Let me tell you then a little bit more about these types of intangible investments, which I hope you will recognize as being the types of assets that you see floating around modern economies to a very large extent. So there are three broad headings. I'll put all the slides up. Here we go. There are three broad headings. The first, some assets around what we call computerized innovation. Second, around innovative property. And the third, around something we call innovative economic competencies. So let's start with computerized innovation. So there are two obvious big assets that companies invest an enormous amount of money in, and that is software and databases. Okay, so you just look around this room, look at the phones in front of you, the computers on the front desk, what's being behind my ability to show you all of these slides. That's all going to be computer software. And the investment in computer software has grown over the period, as we saw just a second ago. Databases is an important aspect of software as well. There are whole companies now whose entire value is essentially around the databases that they have. So one good example of this, I think, is Experian, who are the major credit checking company. And essentially, when you apply for a loan, more or less what happens pretty much automatically is that you type in all your various particulars, it goes to Experian, Experian run a credit check on you, and then the yes or no comes back. So it's a remarkable piece of technology, and it's essentially a software business. They've got immense amounts of software which will answer the question and give you the answer back, and then loads of software which does all the checking and then computes the score for you. So there's plenty around there. And this, of course, is the area where people talk about big data. So the potential to use big data and the potential to exploit these data assets, it comes under that first heading there. Okay, second part of all of this is around the heading of innovative property. So the way to think about innovative property is a sort of set of assets which firms are building, which probably can be protected by some form of intellectual property. So what would they be? So an obvious one is R&D. There's loads of R&D going on in Imperial College, so I hopefully don't have to explain that, some of which is patented, many of which, of course, is open source, but there's some potentially the institution of intellectual property which might protect that. Mineral exploration is actually very big bananas in the UK and in Norway. It's sort of R&D as well, but it turns out to be an accounting heading. The accountants often have a separate heading for the type of spending that oil and gas companies do when they're prospecting for resources. Now, moving then along to the third heading here, the development of copyright and artistic originals is a third important kind of area, and that's, of course, where Harry Potter comes in. Okay? So the money that firms are spending developing the artistic originals, making movies, writing screenplays, developing musical compositions and all of that, Harry Potter, the Beatles, that's all under that heading. And increasingly, not only individuals, but firms are spending lots of money investing in all of this as well. Finally, firms spend enormous amounts of money, of course, on design. iPhones, things like that. One of the reasons why they look so beautiful is all the money which is spent on the design around them. So again, this is another kind of intangible type of investment, a significant knowledge investment, and all these investments are getting much more important in the economy. Finally, three sets of headings under the heading of economic competencies. And these are headings which, it seems to me, is much more difficult to defend by some means of intellectual property, but are going to be quite important in building up the knowledge kind of sitting within a firm. So firms are obviously very interested in market research and advertising. So the EasyJets of this world, for example, are very good at all of that. Business process investment. Firms employ expensive consultants to help them figure out, improving business processes and improving the way that they do things. And then training and skill development. That's an enormous source of spending by firms, which is quite often forgotten about. Often when we talk about education policy, especially in general elections, we talk about education policy and people think that just means schools and universities. Well, there's a very important locus that people often leave out. £20 billion is spent by firms training their workers. That's another very important area of education policy, which is often not argued much as a matter of public policy, but turns out to be very, very important in the data. Okay, so that's what I mean by intangible investments. And the work that economists has been doing has been an attempt to document how this nature of investment has changed over time. So let's just have a look at a couple of diagrams of that. So I already showed you this US diagram here of steady increase in the US in the intangibles and then relatively flat for the tangibles. Here is the same diagram for the UK over a much shorter time range because we don't have as much data. And what you can see is a similar pattern to the end time in the US there, where intangible spending came along and fell a lot in the 2000s and then fell in the Great Recession. Sorry, that's tangible spending, I beg your pardon. Whereas intangible spending has been going up, fell down in the Great Recession, obviously, but has held its own as opposed to tangible investment, which is rather falling away. So again, similar to the US, in the UK there's been this increased trend to spending more on these intangibles rather than the tangibles. And then you can look across all of Europe. So again, it's difficult to get data. Let me point at this one here. These are both the same. It's difficult to get data over a longer time. But in Europe, again, there's steady increase in the intangible share and a fall in the tangible share. And here's a line for the Great Recession over here. And one thing that you can see is that there was a sort of a crossing point right around, well, just after the Great Recession. So one way to kind of think about this is that around the end of the early 2000s, the major developed economies, these are the major European economies essentially, reached this crossing point. The tangible investment for every pound that was being spent, or every euro that was being spent, or every dollar, an equal amount was being spent in the intangible investment as well. That's quite a profound change in the structure of these economies. And then this graph here, just this sort of slightly different way of showing these data, which I'm just going to leave just for the moment. Now, one thing about all of this is that there is very interesting variation in this investment across different countries. So one of the ways that the research has gone is to try to see whether we can shed a bit of light on understanding whether this stuff matters or not by looking at what's happening across different countries. Now, the minute I go across different countries, I'm going to be forced to, unfortunately, annoy some people from some countries and please some people from other countries. So apologies. So we're going to start in Spain and Italy. So apologies if you're from Spain and Italy. Spain and Italy have been performing pretty badly in the sense of intangible investment. So let's take Spain here. This line tells you that in Spain, around 20% of investment is tangible investment and around 6% is intangible investment. In Italy, 15% is tangible, 7% is intangible investment. So there's Spain and Italy there. So they're at the left-hand side of this graph. They are the countries which seem to be spending the least in intangible investment. Right? Let's go over to the right-hand side of this graph. We'll come to the middle in just a second. Let's go to the right-hand side. And the US and Sweden are on the right-hand side. And here you can see it's the opposite picture. So in Sweden, for example, they spend on tangible investment a bit below 15%, and intangible investment is more, it's creeping up to 15%. Likewise in the US. Okay, so again, those are countries where the spending on knowledge and all these intangibles has overtaken the spending on the pure tangibles. Okay, unlike Spain and Italy. Germany is an interesting case over here. Germany, which many people think of as being a terrific and successful economy and so forth, again, is actually rather behind when it comes to spending on intangible investment, and they spend a lot on tangible investment. That may be related to the high value-added manufacturing sector that Germany has. And you can see there are a series of countries in the middle. Since we're in the UK, let me pick out the UK. The UK is kind of interesting because it's one of those countries which has been spending a lot on intangibles. For every pound of tangibles, it's been spending a lot. It's been spending more than a pound on intangibles. So the UK is one of those interesting economies which has gone past the equality of spending and is now much more intangible intensive. And so there are all sorts of interesting things, ways that we could discuss, which maybe we could take up afterwards, about what these different economies are doing. Now then, so let me leave that on the board. Let me then say a couple more things, and then I will stop. You might ask, well, so what? You might reasonably say, hasn't the nature of investment spending been changing over time in any case? So back in the 1870s, we spent a lot on canals. We don't spend much on canals anymore. Then we spent a lot on railways. We don't spend much on railways anymore. Then we spend a lot on aeroplanes, which we continue to spend, and we spend a lot on roads. So you might just say the nature of investment surely changes over time. And therefore, worrying about making an issue about the transition of the economy from this towards this much more knowledge-intensive economy, you might just say, doesn't make any difference. Right? So one of the things that we've tried to look at is, does it make a difference when the type of investment and the type of assets in the economy become much more knowledge-based relative to what they were before? And we argue it does make a difference, and it makes a difference in a couple of ways. So the first few properties of intangibles are this. The first point is that many of these intangibles are simply unmeasured. A slightly arcane measurement point, but a point which is important to anybody who's holding any stocks and shares or saving any money at all. And it is this. Company accountants basically like to measure everything that they can value. The things that company accountants can value are the tangible things that you see around you. So if you look at Imperial College's company accounts, we know how much our assets are of all the tables and chairs. We know our assets of all those machines over there and the various trucks and buses and so forth we've got outside which kind of drive all the stuff around. That's very tangible stuff, and that you can value. Let's take another example which is up here, which is Sainsbury's. Sainsbury's, this is in 2015, have sales of around 24 billion, And their assets, if you look at their accounts, are 10 billion. And those assets are property and equipment. And every time you go into Sainsbury's, you can literally see Sainsbury's tangible assets, right? The building that they've got, that's very valuable. All the fixtures and fittings, the computers, all the stuff that they have there. You can literally see all of those assets. Let's contrast it, you can see on the right-hand side with Microsoft. So Microsoft have sales of around 85 billion, so, almost 3 times as much, more than 3 times as much as Sainsbury's. And their assets look, well, they're only 5 billion. So this looks remarkable. Somehow or other, Microsoft have got all these assets, have got all these sales with very few assets. Well, again, what are Microsoft assets in the language of Sainsbury's? They are the building of Microsoft and the computers that they've got. And if you add those all up, it adds up to 5 billion. 5 billion is a lot. But of course, that doesn't get at what Microsoft really has as an asset. And its real assets are its knowledge assets, the knowledge that they've got of our behavior through the search engines and of all the software, obviously, that they've been writing over all these years. So the first point is that an interesting feature of this intangibles, which makes it different from canals and roads and railways and all the sort of stuff I was talking about before, is that accountants typically don't know how to measure them. They are able to go to Microsoft and tell you how much the computers and the buildings and so forth are worth, but they're simply reluctant to value how much Microsoft's knowledge is worth, how much their software is worth, because they don't really quite know how to value it, and accountants are very conservative when it comes to figuring out these types of valuations. And that's why, if you look at profitability figures, it does look like we've got some fabulously profitable companies. So if you look at Amazon, another kind of Microsoft example, very few tangible assets, but amazing intangible assets, all the knowledge about our shopping habits and the software and all that kind of thing. Their profitability apparently is very large because their assets are very small, the accountants don't measure very much of it, and their sales are absolutely enormous. So the first thing that makes things different about an intangible economy is that it looks like, because little of this stuff is measured, it looks like these companies are amazingly profitable. And that's why we call our book, if you'll forgive me mentioning it again, Capitalism Without Capital. Because as far as the accountants are concerned, we've got these firms participating in the capitalist economy, but as far as an accountant is concerned, they just don't have any capital underneath them. Okay, so that's the first feature of it. And then the second feature is a set of sort of 4 features, essentially, all beginning with the word S, so we call them the 4 S's. And I'm just going to go through these. I'm just going to go through these quickly. So apologies for this kind of busy slide, and then I'll give you an example, and then we can go to a discussion. So the first feature of these intangibles is that they're often sunk. So what does that mean? The investment cannot be recovered. So if you think about EasyJet, when EasyJet are thinking about putting on a new route, what they do is they send their route planning people, who aren't scientists or anything like that, they're just sort of mathematicians and so forth. They send the route planning people, and they go off and they look up the census, and they look up records about where it is that people travel to. And then if they're, looking for a route in Greece, let's say, they then go to the census data and they say, where do most Greeks living in, let's suppose the route is in London, where do most Greeks living in London live? And then EasyJet thereby make a decision whether to run the route from Gatwick, which is in the south of London, if you're not familiar, or Stansted, which is in the northeast, or Luton, which is in the northwest. Okay, that's kind of R&D, EasyJet style. Now, if they don't go ahead with the route, and often they decide not to go ahead with it, they decide there just isn't the demand for it, they can't get that money back. So they don't spend that much money on these types of things, but nonetheless it takes a bit of money to find out all this stuff and do the market research and do the questionnaires and all that. But if you don't go ahead with the route, you can't get the money back. Right? You've spent all of that money. And so it is what economists call sunk. It's very difficult to recover that money. And that's also going to be the case if you write a piece of software and it doesn't work or customers don't like it, again, you can't get the money back. That's going to be rather different, of course, from tangible investment. Let's just do an example. Suppose Sainsbury's buy a truck, right? But in the particular area where they're operating, I don't know, there isn't much demand, and they decide to close that. They decide to close that shop down, they can sell the truck back. There's a very active second-hand market in trucks. There is not an active second-hand market in R&D or finding out who likes to fly here and who likes to fly there. So it's much more difficult to recover that money, and that's the first feature of intangibles. Second feature of intangibles is around scale, and this should be sort of fairly obvious. Does anybody use Uber? Who uses Uber? Who uses Uber? So you will know that if you fly somewhere abroad and you walk out of the airport and you want to be picked up, you just take your phone out, you press the button, and the same software that works here in this country also works wherever you happen to be. So that's an example of scale. Okay? You can scale that software. Once you've invested in the software, you can scale it everywhere else. Third example is spillovers. A lot of this knowledge investment can be used in principle by others. So if you think about the design of the Apple smartphone, all smartphones pretty much all look like an Apple smartphone. Right? So that design that Apple came up with, more or less everybody has copied that. So again, the other issue about knowledge investment is that other people can find out something about it. And lastly, under the final S, under the heading of synergy. So investment is often synergistic with other intangibles and with human capital. So we started off with Harry Potter. If you think about J.K. Rowling, the intangible asset that she possesses is the wonderful invention of Harry Potter. What makes that so valuable is if she gets together with a movie company, and the movie company have got all these software designers to make all the monsters, they've got all the actors to do all the great acting, they've got the marketing people to sell the films and all that kind of thing. So lots of synergies between all these different intangible investments. So those are the four kind of S's. And they have a whole series of implications. I'll go through the implications just quickly, because I don't want to go on for too long. So the first implication is that if these things are sunk, it's going to be very difficult to get financing. So here's a little excursion into the economics of finance. Most companies, when they go and borrow money, they go and, especially small companies when they're first starting, and they go to a bank and borrow money, well, let me ask you, what is it you think the bank often asks these small companies for as security? People's houses, right? So large numbers of entrepreneurial companies start by the director of the company pledging their house to the bank, and the bank therefore gives them money. In other words, you can lend money against a tangible asset like a house, because if it all goes wrong, the bank can get it back. There's an active second-hand market for sales. On the other hand, if you go to the bank and you say, I've got this software script, or I've got this idea for some R&D, or I've got this new design, the bank aren't going to lend you any money. So the first issue is that our banking system is simply going to be not fit for purpose in this type of new economy. And that therefore explains the emergence of new forms of financial institutions like venture capital and so on, replacing the type of traditional banks that we see. And I think that's going to be a long-run kind of trend. Second issue around spillovers. Lots of examples of spillovers. But we think one of the issues is that the demand for living in cities rises. So one of the features of Silicon Valley, of the ICT and finance cluster around New York and around London, is that it's got lots of people living in very close proximity to each other. Well, there are presumably lots of spillovers, people meeting each other, people exchanging ideas, all that kind of thing. If that raises the demand for cities, well, that has an interesting implication, which is it just raises and raises and raises house prices. So those of you who were here yesterday would hear David Miles, who teaches with me on the MBA course, talking about demand for housing. So a lot of that increase in demand for housing and house prices and all that comes from these types of trends. Thirdly, scalable. These intangible intensive companies are going to get bigger, and then the gap between the laggards and the leaders gets bigger, which I'll talk about in just a second. And thirdly, synergies. Potentially, there are going to be some very large wage gains for the owners of these intangible capital assets. So J.K. Rowling is going to do very well. The actors in the Harry Potter movies are going to do very well. The expert software writers who do all the monsters and all that stuff, they're going to do very well as well by means of all these types of synergies. Okay, let me just give you one example of that here around scale. So again, apologies for this sort of slightly busy slide. Intangible intensive industries, if successful companies want to expand, they may be no more productive. They've got to buy more trucks and all that kind of stuff. In intangible intensive industries, those successful companies expand and they get more productive, and their gap might widen. Let me show you a picture which tells you something about that. This picture done by people at the OECD tells you this. It starts in 2001, goes to 2009. It has productivity in the top 10% firms. That's the sort of frontier firms, and the productivity of everybody else. What you can see in the blue is that the frontier firms in manufacturing, their productivity is growing, and they're growing away from these laggard firms. You see this particularly in services. The frontier firms are growing, and they're growing away from these laggard firms. What are they doing? These frontier firms are probably very intangible intensive, if we measure them well enough. So probably what they're doing is they're simply scaling up, like Uber in the way that I described, across their intangible investments. And that opens up a huge gap between the success of these frontier firms and these firms behind. That has all sorts of implications for the labor market. So this is a kind of an inequality in the product market that probably is going to lead to some inequality in the labor market. The most desirable firms who graduates of Imperial and elsewhere are going to work for are probably they're going to want to work for those frontier firms. These are the Googles and the Apples and the Airbnbs and the Ubers and so forth. Those are going to be the firms that are going to get probably the most, the best students, and they're probably going to, pay more money as well. So the inequality around this performance here transmits probably to inequality in the economy. Okay, so I've been talking much too much, so I promise you this is the final slide to summarize. The economy is getting more and more knowledge intensive. As I mentioned before, this is not well measured, capitalism without capital. Here are some implications. The intangible intensive firms scale up. It's got some implications for inequality, big election issue, here, France, whatever it might be, in the US. The demand for living in cities rises in the way that I described, big implications for house prices. And then banking, as I mentioned before, probably won't be fit for purpose as well. We've got to change the way that we think about banking. So as it says here, the economy will probably continue to change. So thank you all very much for all your attention. Thank you again for coming to the festival. I hope you've had a really good couple of days. I shall stop, and delighted any of you who want to come and carry on the conversation be in the room opposite. So thank you, and again, I hope you've had a good couple of days at the festival.